The cameras were rolling. The lights were perfect. The audience expected another powerful but predictable faith-based interview. Jonathan Roumie sat calmly across from Sid Roth, hands folded, posture relaxed. He looked composed, the same Jonathan millions recognized from The Chosen. The man who portrayed Jesus with depth, humility, and quiet strength. Nothing felt unusual. Until suddenly, everything changed. Sid Roth glanced at his notes, then looked up, and for just a split second, something in his expression shifted. It was subtle, but those who were watching closely could feel it. The room grew quieter. Jonathan noticed it too. There was a pause, longer than normal for live television. No background music. No dramatic build-up. Just silence. Then Sid spoke. "Jonathan, before we go any further, I need to ask you something." Jonathan nodded slowly. Sid continued, "There are moments on this show where I feel something different. And right now, I feel it again." The audience leaned forward. Jonathan's expression changed. Not fear, not surprise, but recognition. As if he knew exactly what Sid was talking about. Sid swallowed hard. "This isn't just another interview, is it?" Jonathan didn't answer immediately. His eyes lowered. His breathing slowed. And that's when people watching at home felt it too. That strange, heavy stillness that doesn't come from silence, but from anticipation. The kind that makes your chest tighten. Jonathan finally looked up. His lips parted, but no words came out. Seconds passed. In live television, seconds feel like minutes. The cameraman hesitated, unsure whether to cut away. The audience stopped moving altogether. Jonathan's eyes began to shine, not with performance, but with emotion he wasn't trying to hide. Sid Roth froze. This wasn't acting. This wasn't scripted. This wasn't planned. Something deeply personal was about to surface. Jonathan cleared his throat. "I didn't expect this. Not today," he said quietly. The audience held its breath. "At first, I thought this role was about preparation, about research, about getting it right." He paused again. "But there was a moment, one moment, where everything I thought I knew collapsed." Sid leaned back in his chair, eyes wide. "What do you mean?" he whispered. Jonathan shook his head slowly. "I don't know if I'm ready to talk about it," he said. "But I think it's time." The room felt different now. Not like a studio. Not like a TV show. But like a place where something real was about to be revealed. And whatever Jonathan Roumie was about to say next would leave everyone watching, in the studio and around the world, completely speechless. To understand why that moment on Sid Roth's show felt so heavy, you first have to understand who Jonathan Roumie really is, and what he carried with him into that studio. Before The Chosen, Jonathan wasn't a global name. He wasn't walking red carpets. He wasn't surrounded by fame or applause. For years, he struggled quietly. Auditions that led nowhere. Roles that paid almost nothing. Moments where doubt whispered, "Is this even worth it?" He believed in God, but belief doesn't erase struggle. Sometimes it actually makes the questions louder. Jonathan had reached a point where acting felt less like a calling, and more like a burden. Then The Chosen came. Not as a guarantee. Not as a promise of success. Just an opportunity. When Jonathan was offered the role of Jesus, his first reaction wasn't excitement. It was fear. How do you portray someone billions worship? How do you carry that responsibility? How do you stand in front of the world knowing every movement, every word will be judged? He prayed. Not for fame. Not for recognition. But for strength. From the beginning, Jonathan made one decision very clear. This role would never be about performance alone. He fasted. He studied scripture. He prayed before scenes, sometimes alone, sometimes with the crew. But the deeper he went, the heavier it became. Because portraying Jesus didn't just demand skill. It demanded surrender. There were nights Jonathan couldn't sleep. Moments where scenes stayed with him long after the cameras stopped rolling. He wasn't just memorizing lines. He was confronting parts of himself he had spent years avoiding. Fear. pride, doubt, and the quiet question every believer asks at some point. Am I really worthy to do this? By the time he walked onto Sid Roth's set, Jonathan had already carried this weight for years. The audience saw confidence. But inside, there was something unresolved. Sid Roth, on the other hand, wasn't new to moments like this. He had interviewed pastors, prophets, survivors, skeptics, and believers from every background imaginable. He had heard miracle stories. He had witnessed emotional breakdowns. He had seen moments that never made it to air. But something about Jonathan felt different from the moment he walked in. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just heavy. As the cameras rolled, the conversation began normally. Sid asked about The Chosen. About audience reactions. About how Jonathan prepared for the role. Jonathan answered thoughtfully, respectfully, carefully. But Sid noticed something. Jonathan kept pausing, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he was choosing what not to say. There were moments where his eyes drifted away from the camera. Moments where his voice softened unexpectedly. Sid had learned to recognize that sign. It meant someone was holding back. And Sid Roth didn't believe in avoiding moments like that. He believed in leaning into them. So he slowed the conversation. He stopped pushing forward. And instead, he waited. The studio audience felt it too. They weren't just watching a show anymore. They were watching a man standing at the edge of something deeply personal. Jonathan's mind drifted. Not to the present moment, but to a specific memory. A moment on set. A moment between takes. A moment when the cameras were off. But everything inside him felt exposed. He hadn't planned to talk about it. He never thought he would share it publicly. Some experiences feel too sacred. Too fragile. You fear that saying them out loud might break them. Jonathan shifted slightly in his seat. Sid noticed. You don't have to share anything you're not ready for, Sid said gently. Jonathan nodded. I know, he replied. But something inside him stirred. A quiet pressure. The kind that doesn't come from people, but from within. From faith. From obedience. From that inner voice saying, this moment isn't just for you. Jonathan took a deep breath. He looked at Sid. Then at the audience. Then briefly at the floor. And that's when the atmosphere began to change. Not dramatically. Not suddenly. But unmistakably. The kind of shift that makes a room feel still. As if everyone senses they're about to witness something that wasn't rehearsed. Jonathan folded his hands tightly. His voice lowered. Before I answer your next question, he said quietly, there's something I think I need to say first. Sid leaned forward. The cameras stayed close. The audience didn't move. Because whatever Jonathan Roumie was about to reveal next wasn't about acting. It wasn't about television. It was about a moment that changed him forever. And once spoken, there would be no taking it back. Jonathan Roumie took a slow breath. Not the kind actors take before delivering a line, but the kind people take when they're about to step into something vulnerable. For a long time, he began, I tried to separate my faith from my work. His voice was calm, but fragile. I told myself, I'm just an actor doing a job. But the truth is, this role wouldn't let me do that. The studio was silent. No coughs. No movement. Even the air felt heavy. Jonathan's eyes lowered as memories surfaced. There was a day on set, he continued, when everything felt wrong. The scene wasn't emotional. There were no dramatic lines. No miracles. No crowd. Just a quiet moment between takes. Jonathan stood in costume, robe still on, sandals dusty from the set floor. Crew members moved around him, adjusting lights, checking cameras. And yet, he felt completely alone. I remember thinking, he said, why does this feel so heavy? He hadn't done anything wrong. But inside him, something was breaking. Jonathan described how the weight of expectation began to crush him. Fans wrote letters saying the show changed their lives. People told him they saw Jesus differently because of his performance. And instead of feeling honored, he felt afraid. What if I fail them? What if I misrepresent something sacred? What if I let God down? The pressure didn't come from the producers. It didn't come from the audience. It came from himself. Sid Roth leaned back in his chair, listening intently. This wasn't a celebrity struggle. This was a spiritual one. Jonathan paused, swallowing hard. There was a moment, he said, when I realized I was trying to carry something that was never meant for me to carry. He described how, during that break, he walked away from the set. Not to rehearse. Not to prepare. But to hide. He found a quiet corner behind the soundstage. No cameras. No crew. Just him. He sat down and removed the costume. And that's when it hit him. I started questioning everything, Jonathan admitted. My worth. My obedience. My motives. His voice trembled slightly. I thought if I just worked harder, prayed more, fasted longer, I could earn the right to be there. The audience shifted in their seats, because that feeling was familiar. Trying to earn love. Trying to earn approval. Trying to earn grace. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly, as if reliving the moment. I felt unqualified, he said. Not unprepared. Unqualified. Sid's expression changed. That word carried weight. Jonathan explained how he had always believed faith meant strength, confidence, certainty, peace. But in that moment, faith felt like exposure. Like being seen completely, and still standing there empty-handed. I was angry, he admitted. Not at God, but at myself. He lowered his head. I kept thinking, why me? Why would God choose someone so broken to represent something so holy? The silence grew heavier. Sid Roth had heard confessions before, but rarely one spoken with such honesty. Jonathan continued. That's when I realized the conflict wasn't about the role. He looked up now. It was about control. Jonathan explained that he was trying to own the responsibility, to manage the outcome, to protect the message, to make sure nothing went wrong. But faith doesn't work that way. The more I tried to control it, he said, the more empty I felt. His hands tightened together. And then, something happened. The room leaned in. Jonathan described how he finally stopped fighting. How he stopped rehearsing. How he stopped trying to fix himself. He simply sat there, exhausted. I told God, he said quietly, if this is too much for me, then take it away. That confession hung in the air. Not dramatic. Not desperate. Just honest. Sid Roth felt his chest tighten. Because that prayer wasn't about quitting. It was about surrender. Jonathan paused again, longer this time. The studio waited. I didn't hear a voice, Jonathan said. There was no thunder. No vision. He shook his head slightly. But something shifted. He felt the pressure lift. Not instantly. Not magically. But enough. Enough to breathe. Enough to stand. Enough to realize the role was never his to protect. The conflict ended when I stopped trying to be worthy, he said softly, and accepted that worth was never the requirement. Sid Roth exhaled slowly. The audience sat frozen. Because Jonathan Roumie hadn't just shared a struggle. He had exposed a battle many people fight quietly. Between faith and fear, surrender and control. And the shocking moment everyone would soon witness wasn't what Jonathan did next. It was what he realized. That changed everything. When Jonathan Roumie finished speaking, no one moved. Not Sid Roth. Not the audience. Not even the camera crew. The silence didn't feel awkward. It felt sacred. Sid sat perfectly still, hands resting on his knees, eyes locked on Jonathan, not as a host, not as an interviewer, but as a man absorbing something deeply personal. He had hosted this show for decades. He had heard testimonies, confessions, miracles, and revelations. But this was different. This wasn't a story meant to impress. It was a truth meant to be witnessed. The studio lights hummed softly. The red recording light blinked. Yet somehow, it felt like time had slowed. Jonathan's hands loosened as if a physical weight had been released. He hadn't planned to say any of that. He hadn't rehearsed it. And now that the words were out, the room felt changed. Sid finally broke the silence, but not with a question. He swallowed. "Jonathan," he said quietly, "I feel something very strong right now." His voice wavered, just slightly. The audience felt it too. Some leaned forward. Others sat frozen. A woman in the second row wiped her eyes without realizing it. This wasn't emotional manipulation. There was no music. No cue. Just the raw aftermath of honesty. Jonathan nodded slowly. "So do I," he replied. Sid stood up, something he rarely did mid-interview. He paced a few steps, then stopped. "When you were speaking," Sid said, "I wasn't thinking about television." He turned to the audience. "I wasn't thinking about ratings." He turned back to Jonathan. "I felt stillness." The word hung in the air. Stillness. A crew member hesitated near the camera controls, unsure whether this was a moment to cut away or to stay. Sid raised his hand gently, signaling them to keep rolling. "This is not something we rush," he said softly. Jonathan sat back in his chair, eyes lowered again. The vulnerability hadn't faded. If anything, it had deepened. For the first time since the show began, Jonathan wasn't acting. He wasn't representing a role. He was simply present. The audience noticed something else too. Jonathan's breathing had changed. Slower. Steadier. As if surrender had brought peace, not chaos. Sid returned to his seat, but didn't pick up his notes. "I've interviewed thousands of guests," he said, "and I've learned to recognize when a moment is different." He paused. "This is one of those moments." The audience remained silent. Some nodded. Others clasped their hands. A man near the back closed his eyes. Jonathan looked up. His eyes met Sid's, not with fear, not with uncertainty, but with trust. Sid asked gently, "What you described, that surrender, do you feel it right now?" Jonathan considered the question. Then he answered honestly. "Yes," he said. "And no." A few people smiled faintly. "It's not a one-time thing," Jonathan continued. "It's a choice. Over and over." Sid nodded. "That honesty," he said, "is why this is landing so deeply." The cameras slowly panned across the audience. Faces showed emotion, but not spectacle. This wasn't excitement. It was recognition. People saw themselves in Jonathan's struggle. Their own attempts to be strong. Their own exhaustion. Their own quiet prayers of, "I can't do this anymore." Jonathan shifted slightly. He hadn't expected his words to carry this weight. "I didn't share this to be dramatic," he said. "I shared it because I think someone needs to hear it." Sid leaned forward. "I think many people do," he replied. The room felt warmer now. Not louder. Warmer. Like a burden had been acknowledged, even if it hadn't been lifted completely. A pause followed. Then something subtle happened. Sid reached out and placed his hand gently over Jonathan's. It wasn't planned. It wasn't scripted. And it wasn't about television. The gesture alone changed the atmosphere. Jonathan didn't pull away. He didn't speak. He simply closed his eyes. The audience instinctively did the same. No one had been asked to. It just happened. For a brief moment, the studio wasn't a studio. It was a shared space of reflection, of humility, of quiet faith. When Jonathan opened his eyes again, they looked different. Not lighter. Not heavier. Clearer. And that's when Sid realized something. This wasn't the shocking moment everyone would talk about. That moment was still coming. This was the preparation. Because what Jonathan was about to say next would move this encounter from reaction to revelation. The room was already quiet, but now it felt expectant. Not the kind of silence that waits for words, but the kind that waits for truth. Jonathan Roumie sat with his eyes closed for a moment longer than usual. When he opened them, his gaze wasn't fixed on Sid Roth anymore. It drifted slightly upward, as if he was listening. Sid noticed. He didn't interrupt. He didn't move. He had learned that moments like this can't be rushed. Jonathan finally spoke. Slowly. "There's something I've never shared publicly," he said. The audience froze. Even the camera crew leaned in. Jonathan's voice was steady now. Not because the moment was easy, but because the decision had already been made. "During one of the hardest days on set," Jonathan continued, "I reached a point where I was completely empty." He paused. "I wasn't praying anymore." That admission landed hard. "I wasn't asking for answers," he said. "I was asking for escape." Sid's eyebrows lifted slightly. Jonathan swallowed. "I sat alone in silence," he said. "And for the first time, I stopped performing, even for God." The word performing hung heavy in the air. Jonathan leaned forward. "And that's when it happened." The audience collectively inhaled. "I didn't hear an audible voice," he said again. "But the message was unmistakable." He closed his eyes briefly. "This isn't about you." The words fell softly, but their weight filled the room. Jonathan continued. "I realized I had made this role about my ability, my preparation, my worth." He shook his head slowly. "And it was never meant to be." Sid Roth covered his mouth with his hand. The audience remained frozen. Jonathan's voice lowered. "What I felt in that moment," he said, "was not correction. It was release." A tear slipped down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. "I felt God say, I don't need you to be perfect. I need you to be available." The studio cracked open. Not with noise, but with emotion. Sid looked away briefly, struggling to compose himself. "I've interviewed prophets," Sid said quietly. "And I've interviewed skeptics." He looked back at Jonathan. "But what you just described, that's surrender." Jonathan nodded. "That's when everything changed," he said. He explained how, from that day forward, the pressure didn't disappear. But it no longer owned him. "I stopped trying to represent Jesus," he said. "I started trying to reflect him." That distinction silenced the room again. Jonathan continued. "I walked back onto set differently. Same costume, same lines, but not the same heart." Sid leaned forward, eyes glistening. "What did that do to you?" he asked. Jonathan answered without hesitation. "It freed me." The word echoed. Freed. Not from responsibility, but from fear. Jonathan explained how scenes that once terrified him became moments of trust. Not because he felt strong, but because he had stopped relying on strength. "And the shocking part," Jonathan said softly, "is that I didn't feel closer to God because I tried harder. I felt closer because I finally stopped trying." The audience shifted, some nodding, some crying quietly. Sid placed both hands on the desk. "This is not something you act out," he said. "This is something you live through." Jonathan nodded again. "And that's why this moment matters," he said. "Because there are people watching right now who feel unqualified, exhausted, like they're carrying something too heavy for them." He looked directly into the camera now. "And I want them to know that surrender is not weakness. It's the beginning of peace." The studio remained silent. No applause. No music. Just stillness. Sid finally spoke, barely above a whisper. "This is the moment," he said. "That changed the atmosphere." Jonathan exhaled slowly. Because the reveal wasn't about a miracle. It wasn't about fame. It was about the quiet truth. That left everyone watching, completely speechless. After the words were spoken, nothing needed to be added. Jonathan Roumie leaned back in his chair, as if he had finally set something down that he'd been carrying for years. The room didn't rush to fill the silence. Sid Roth didn't reach for another question. The audience didn't applaud. Everyone understood. This moment wasn't meant to be followed by commentary. It was meant to be felt. Sid took a slow breath. "I believe," he said gently, "that people watching right now are realizing something about themselves." Jonathan nodded. "That's my prayer," he replied. "Because this wasn't about me telling a story. It was about releasing one. Sid smiled faintly. "You look lighter," he said. Jonathan paused, considering the words. "I am," he answered honestly. "But not because something changed around me. Because something changed in me." The audience responded not with noise, but with understanding. Some nodded. Some wiped their eyes. Some sat still, hands folded, processing their own quiet battles. Sid turned briefly to the camera. "If you're watching," he said, "and you feel overwhelmed, like you're carrying a responsibility too big for you." He paused. "You're not alone." Jonathan listened, head bowed slightly. Sid turned back to him. "How has this changed the way you walk forward?" he asked. Jonathan didn't hesitate. "I no longer measure success by impact," he said. "I measure it by obedience." The simplicity of the statement landed deeply. Whether the scene is powerful or quiet, whether the response is loud or silent. He shrugged gently. "I've learned to trust the outcome." Sid nodded. "That's freedom," he said. Jonathan smiled, not a performance smile, but a quiet one. "Yes," he replied. "And it's something I'm still learning every day." The tension that once filled the room was gone now. In its place was peace. Not excitement. Not spectacle. Peace. Sid closed his notebook. "For those who expected an interview," he said, "thank you for staying. For those who needed a reminder," he continued, "this moment was for you." Jonathan looked out at the audience. "I didn't come here to shock anyone," he said. "But if something today stirred your heart." He paused. "Listen to it." The audience remained silent. But the silence felt different now. It wasn't heavy. It was open. Sid stood slowly. "We don't need to say more," he said. Jonathan stood with him. They shared a brief embrace. Not for cameras, not for show, but as two people acknowledging a sacred exchange. As Jonathan prepared to leave the stage, he glanced back one last time. Not with pride, not with relief, but with gratitude. Because the resolution wasn't about closure. It was about clarity. A clarity that said, you don't have to carry everything. You don't have to earn grace. You don't have to be perfect to be chosen. Sometimes, the most powerful resolution is realizing you were never alone in the struggle. And as the studio lights dimmed, everyone watching knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a television moment. It was a turning point. As the episode came to an end, there was no dramatic music to signal closure. No applause cue. No final punchline. Because some moments don't end. They linger. Long after the cameras stopped rolling, people in the studio sat quietly, aware that they had witnessed something rare. Not a performance. Not a viral clip. But a reminder. Jonathan Roumie's story wasn't shocking because of what he said. It was shocking because of what it revealed about strength. We often believe strength means control. Holding everything together. Never admitting weakness. But what unfolded on Sid Roth's show told a different story. True strength begins where pretending ends. Jonathan didn't rise in that moment because he had all the answers. He rose because he finally laid the burden down. And that lesson reaches far beyond a television studio. Every day, people carry expectations no one sees. Responsibilities they didn't ask for. Faith they're afraid they're failing. They smile. They function. They keep going. But inside, they're exhausted. What Jonathan revealed is something many people never hear. You don't have to earn peace. You don't have to perform faith. You don't have to be flawless to be faithful. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you can't do it alone. The moment Jonathan stopped trying to prove himself was the moment everything shifted. Not because the pressure disappeared, but because it no longer defined him. That's the quiet power of surrender. Not giving up, but letting go. Not weakness, but trust. And that's why this moment left everyone speechless. Because it reminded us that faith isn't about appearing strong. It's about being honest. As the final seconds of the show faded, one truth remained. You never know who's watching your life. Not for perfection, but for permission. Permission to be human. Permission to rest. Permission to trust. If you're watching this right now and feel overwhelmed, this message wasn't an accident. It's a reminder that you're not behind. You're not broken. You're not failing. You're learning how to release what was never meant to be yours. And sometimes, that release is the miracle. So before you scroll away, take a moment. Breathe. Ask yourself what you've been carrying, that you were never meant to carry alone. Then let it go. Because true peace doesn't come from control. It comes from surrender. Backhand index pointing right. If this story touched you, type Amen in the comments. Backhand index pointing right. Share where you're watching from. Your voice matters here. Backhand index pointing right. And if you believe humility is real strength, type respect. Thank you for staying until the end. May this message meet you exactly where you are. And may you walk forward lighter than before.